There we go. And that should begin recording now. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. This is our first research assessment and evaluation community of practice roundtable. So I'm very happy that everybody here was able to join us. I wanted to start by centering where we are. Now, I am in Calgary, and Calgary is located in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot. And I really feel that it's important for everyone to understand where they are and whose land they are on. So I am in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Eahey Nakoda, and is also, city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation. Today, we are going to have a fairly simple agenda. It's going to be doing our introductions first. Then we will be going into the panel questions, then into roundtable questions. So when we come to the roundtable questions, it's essentially going to be the same questions that I've just asked Jeff and Sarah. So to start out, we're going to do some quick introductions. So I'm going to introduce our team first, and then they are going to do a little bit more of an introduction of themselves. So I'm Noah Arney. I'm the Career Services Coordinator at Thompson Rivers University, and I am one of the co-chairs of Research Assessment and Evaluation. With me also is Sarah Wills, Manager of Integrated Learning and Assessment at Western University, and Jeff Burrow, Manager Assessment and Analysis of Student Life at University of Toronto. Sarah, if you could introduce yourself a bit more, and then Jeff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noah. So as Noah mentioned, I'm the Manager of Integrated Learning and Assessment at Western University within the Student Experience portfolio. And I am located on the traditional lands of the Attawandaron, Lenape-Wook, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I am very excited to be joining you all, not just to share some of what I've learned in my career, but also to hear from you what's working well at your institutions. And the majority of my role focuses on not only understanding student development within a particular department, but across our division, as well as thinking a little bit about how do we embed assessment into our co-curricular learning opportunities, which on my campus really focus on thriving for both students and educators. And to give a quick background of how I got here, I have worked at 4 institutions in my career and been a part of assessment, building and capacity within all of those. And my journey really started as a student at Lakehead University, being a student leader, where I learned as a B.Ed student that you can actually teach and think about learning outside of the formal 4 walls of a classroom. And that changed the way that I thought about teaching and learning. And at the same time, I was paired with Dale Mullings as a mentor who worked at UTM, who was doing his grad work in this thing called Learning Outcomes Assessment. And he taught me so much about it. And I really saw this connection between my love of understanding student development and the intentionality between that and outcomes-based assessment. And so from there, I decided to pursue an MED in assessment and curriculum design. And I've never looked back. And now I get to work with wonderful folks like Noah and Jeff as we think about what does this work look like across our field in Canada.
Thank you. And Jeff.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Burrow. As Noah said, I'm the Manager of Assessment and Analysis for Student Life at the St. George campus of the University of Toronto. I'm also here at the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Like Sarah, I have fairly broad divisional responsibilities. I spend a fair bit of time doing a lot of one-on-one work directly with staff and or their directors, but I probably spend an equal or sometimes more time doing secondary data analysis on a lot of large-scale surveys, some of which you might use at your institutions, like the National Survey of Student Engagement, the Canadian Campus Wellbeing Survey, and National College Health Assessment. How I got into assessment, I would say I had just started my master's degree in ed at Queen's 10-ish years ago. And I guess I was sharing with one of my new classmates, we're all talking about our research interests or, why we came to grad school. And I said I was really interested in study abroad and study student exchanges. And it turns out that that person was married to the person who was the coordinator of research and assessment at Queen's, and they were about to begin a project about student exchanges. That person is Sarah's boss, or Sarah's boss's boss, Jenny Massey. So I think sort of the moral of that story, it never hurts to share sort of the kinds of things you're interested on, because you never know sort of what networks and things like that you might just be one step away from.
Thank you. So we're going to get now into the panel questions for the two of you. So how this is going to work for everyone is we're going to go back and forth. And so one person will answer the first question, and then the next person will answer it. And then that person will answer the question after. So we'll sort of do a back and forth, giving people a little more time to think between questions if they need it. And some of them, especially the first questions, really are compound questions, whereas other ones are a little more straightforward. And at the end, we're actually going to be opening up a lot of these questions to everybody to answer. And so we get a bit of an idea of what things look like at other people's institutions as well. Our first question today is, what does assessment look like at your institution? So some things that we're interested in are process and structure, who does it, when and where do they do it, what's the assessment cycle, how is assessment communicated, and what works well and what could be better. And that's a pretty massive question. And we're actually going to start with Jeff.
I was hoping Sarah was going to answer that first. If I were to think about how that operates at the St. George campus of the University of Toronto, mindful that that's 60,000 students in a division with 13 departments, and U of T people always talk about this, but it's a really, really decentralized structure. Even within our division of student affairs, the departments are very, very large. And I would say I work relatively little at a full divisional level and an awful lot at the department level. So maybe the Career Center is a good example that I would consult a fair bit with them on things like a curriculum framework, on overall strategy. I would work a lot with individual staff members on individual assessment plans, developing learning outcomes, thinking about ideas to maybe embed some formative assessment into the work that they do. In terms of the assessment cycle, we always have those sort of we have this mix of things that happen once and never again. We have the idea of some things that happen or something similar happens every single week, a workshop, an event, a training seminar that happens over and over again. We have some of those really large one-off events. If we're sort of thinking about careers folks, the idea of like career fairs sort of comes up. It's an often once a year sort of type of thing. So it's a really, really big event. In terms of communication, we have a communications team that is separate from our, as a standalone separate department. Some divisions or departments probably do a lot of their communication of assessment results and processes on their own. Some departments would probably work a little bit more with the communication folks. And I think maybe that's kind of part of the answer to the last question, right? Whereas I think there are definitely, and this would be true at all institutions, there are some directors that have a very large focus and emphasize ideas of assessment or evaluation or whatever language they use. I'm happy to use whatever language people want to use. I don't sort of push my language on them, that are very focused and oriented and really push their teams in those directions. And then there's some directors they're not there yet. So we think about this in terms of culture assessment. There are, of course, folks at all sort of levels of any of these hierarchies. So what works better? I really struggle with the idea of division-wide assessment. I really struggle in thinking about how that can be meaningful. But I think strategy is a place that probably every institution or division of student affairs probably struggles with to varying degrees. And the hardest thing maybe right now is actually just dedicating the time to bring together to focus on division-wide things when so many people are just trying to keep things, their own programs, services, and supports for students going. So those are some things I think a lot about assessment, at least the St. George part of U of T.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Sarah.
Thank you, Jeff. In some ways, Western is very similar to U of T structure, and in other ways we look very different. Similar to Jeff, our process and structure is more centralized, where we work with different departments. but also recognizing that there's decentralized pieces as well. And that certainly plays into how we think about interacting with colleagues and campus stakeholders. In my case, for example, something like residence life is not within student experience or student affairs. So they don't technically report through us or have the same strategic vision as our division does, but yet they still want to do the work, and we help and support them where we can. And so thinking about how we be collaborative, not just within our own units, but outside of that as well. And really support the areas that have a deep interest in assessment, recognizing that we might have a bit more resource or support than they do currently. And so basically I operate on the research assessment and planning team, which is within the office of the Associate Vice President Student Experience, Jenny Massey, as Jeff alluded to. And we have a small team that really focuses on thinking divisionally about research, assessment, and planning, and how we can support each of the departments or units that fall within our strategic area on how to do this work as effectively and efficiently as possible. So really our process and structure is we have a small team that really helps think about how do we continue to develop assessment culture and highlight the importance of understanding student learning outside the classroom. And in our case, our strategic plan is related to creating a campus ecosystem where students and educators thrive. So we work with different units to talk about how do you connect to the strategic plan? How do you think that you help our students thrive? And how can we support you in creating tools and engaging in outcomes development to be able to understand that better and to do some program redesign as we need to and understand our students' needs. So really our role in that is just helping build competence, capacity, and interest in doing assessment. When we think about who does it, we believe and really take the approach that all student affairs educators should be doing assessment. So we think about not just how do we do it for them, but how do we provide tools and training and capacity. And primarily, I would say my work is in consultations of working with individuals and units in asking them, like, what do you hope to know? What do you want your students to achieve? And then how do we work together to understand if that's happening? Being mindful of the 3 M's that we talk about a lot: meaningful, measurable, and manageable assessment. Instead of expecting everyone to assess everything all the time, we do support them when they're excited about doing surveys or initiatives, but we're very mindful of selecting 2 to 3 what we call signature programs from each department per year that we specifically work with to design outcomes and tailored assessment measures and report on. And that actually makes it a lot more meaningful for folks, and they're not as intimidated by that. And then that leads into our assessment cycle. So if you're familiar with my colleague, Leslie D'Souza, she is very much involved in this approach to design thinking assessment. And so at Western, we have an adapted version of Mackey's assessment cycle with this design thinking approach that really focuses on understanding student empathy. So what is a student's experience and feeling, and how are they understanding their student experience? And then how does that play into how we design outcomes for them, how we explore and test if our outcomes meet those pieces, look at the data, continue to empathize with students, and move through that cycle again. And that's all really communicated through her office. So she is the director of storytelling and digital engagement. And so while we utilize that design thinking assessment model to understand the data in our students, our departments actually work with her and her team, also located in the office of the AVP SE, to then storytell and get that data out and connect with students and close the loop. So I think that in some ways works really well, that we have the resources to be able to dedicate to understanding assessment and storytelling it. But I would say, like Jeff alluded to, given that we're constantly pivoting, or at least it feels like we're constantly pivoting right now during this time, capacity and just interest and workload is certainly a struggle that we could certainly get better at, and I hope we do. But also just resourcing. While I recognize we're very lucky to have the resourcing that we do, I think to do assessment well, you can really never have enough people or enough training or enough buy-in. So I would say building capacity is probably what we could continue to work on doing better.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And you're going to be continuing on with us for the next question, and that's about leadership. So how does assessment leadership work at your institution? Is there somebody who's responsible for it? And how much of their role is it? How do they collate assessment? Tell us a little bit about how that works for your institution.
Sure. So I think I can be succinct in this one because I think I addressed many of these questions in the last response. But there is technically a team that oversees assessment and is responsible for building capacity and making sure that it's happening and supporting units. But it's also the unit's responsibility, especially the folks who lead those signature programs, to be invested in it and to make it a part of their, everyday work with students. And that's why we really believe in that 3M model: manageable, measurable, meaningful, because we don't want it to be a second full-time job for folks. We want them to integrate it into the work they're already doing, but to come to us for support and guidance. And so I would say it's a small piece of their role, but certainly one that's an important part of their job. Maybe not as much, they don't think about it as much day to day as I probably do, but really trying to build this culture where it is a piece of everybody's role, and the supports and resources are there to help them do that in a more meaningful way. And then in terms of collection, so we usually help develop the tool with them and with students. And then we take on the actual tool design and building. They send out the link, they encourage people to do it, they recruit the students who are participating in whatever tool they use. And then we collect the data on their behalf and do analysis. And rather than just simply writing a report and saying, here's your data, we do analysis, we bring them back to the table so that they can help contextualize this data for us because they're the content experts, and really do that empathizing with student piece. And then together we write a formal assessment report that we share out.
Thank you. I love that model that you have there at Western, by the way. Jeff.
I think if I were to think of at least the St. George campus of the University of Toronto, I am the person probably who has the broadest title as it relates to assessment. It's literally in my title. But the other half of that is analysis, and that often sort of supersedes the assessment piece. Analysis requests tend to come from people with much fancier job titles than I, and those are hard requests to sort of push off till later. We also have 2 additional staff within our division, one in health and wellness, one very new starting on our academic success team that will focus much more at that departmental level. And I think that's awesome to have someone who can be specialist within those divisions. But as Sarah sort of was talking about, that's a huge resource investment that we know that not all sort of institutions, it would be a struggle for a lot of institutions, and not even every one of our departments have that. If I were to guess, I haven't actually looked at all the job descriptions, but I imagine, I just wrote in the chat box, I'd be surprised if in the top 5 bullet points or something of a lot of people's student-facing staff, that assessment isn't, or something in that namesake isn't listed. Maybe they'd consider it 5 to sort of 10% of their job. How they collate this, that's a hard word for me. Sarah mentioned a few platforms. We use Campus Labs a lot, we use Microsoft Forms a lot. I know staff that have real orientations to sort of a lot of formative assessment are probably seeing what they can do within some of these tools, Zoom or Teams or the other platforms, to sort of what they can be doing for a lot of formative assessment activities, poll everywhere, those sort of types of things. But some of those things you can integrate into the platform. So I think it's been a real learning experience for a lot of folks over the last, over the last 9 months. The collation, I would say most of this probably goes individual staff member to their deck report, and then some of those pieces go from their director to like our, some snippets and things like that or whatever. And that's probably the place where I think there are some directors that probably have a really good process for and set of expectations for what they want their staff's individual staff sort of department reports to look like at the end of a semester, end of an academic year, whatever their time frame are. And I think there's some places where that's probably where I or the folks I work with probably need to be more supportive, because everybody loves a good exemplar or template. Folks can edit them and make them work for their department and the nature of the work that they do better. Asking folks to sort of start this from a blank sheet of paper is a really challenging spot. So I think the answer to all these things is it depends, but I think there's some really interesting examples happening at U of T depending on the departments.
Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, thank you both. I think that helps everybody get a much better understanding of how assessment leadership works at your institution. So thank you. Continuing with Jeff, and this is a question that, of course, ever gets brought up quite frequently, is what's the difference And I know that you both have done entire hour-long webinars on what the difference is, but see if you can do it in 3 minutes. Jeff, what is the difference between assessment, evaluation, and research?
I'm going to pass to Sarah. Sorry. I hope that's okay.
Not a problem. Let's pass to the expert.
He's deferred his time. Jeff and I actually did a presentation on this with my colleagues at Western a few weeks ago. And so I'm going to share how we spoke about assessment, evaluation, and research as succinctly as possible. And then Noah, I'm going to invite you to jump in because Noah has a very 3-word succinct way of thinking about it, which I really appreciated the framework of. So assessment, and I think I just want to draw on the point that Jeff mentioned earlier, that it's not about pushing the language on people. I think generally we know what we mean by these different things. And at least at Western, we really do try and educate through our guides and our conversations around the difference. But at the end of the day, it's really just the fact that someone's interested in data. And regardless if they use the word assessment, evaluation, or research, they've bought in and they want to know something more. And so we really just try and leverage that and use appreciative inquiry to understand, well, what do you want to know? How does that help shape your program? What would your ideal goals look like in terms of the information you want to know? And then we use that to understand, are they looking for assessment, evaluation, or is this more of a formal research piece? So when we say assessment, at least at Western, we're talking about the knowledge, skills, values that students gain from our supports and services. So really that outcomes focused. Are our programs effective? Are they achieving our overarching goals and objectives? And are they providing opportunities for student learning? If so, how effectively are they doing that? It's really about the student. When we think about evaluation, we talk a lot about the structure of the program and how that structure is built to effectively support that learning for that student. And thinking about how can we redesign some structures that impact that learning experience. So for example, alignment to mission, vision, values, our staffing models and resources done properly. Can we be thinking about facilities, spaces, for example? And my colleague Erin and I like to talk about it as a basket. So evaluation is understanding the basket. So how is it woven together? Is it the right shape? Is it too big? Is it too small? Does it have all the pieces it needs to effectively support those student programs that we put inside of it? So really thinking about evaluating the structure of the basket and the programs to get a sense of if it's helping us achieve the assessment and programs we're trying to think about. And then for us, research really involves the collection of information for the purpose of gaining knowledge, developing theory, or testing key concepts and structures. So some critical questions that we're asking and doing some, really intense testing, let's say, as opposed to our approach to assessment or evaluation that tends to be more QA/QI, quality assurance, quality improvement related. Okay, I'm going to pitch it over to Noah to succinctly take everything I said and break it down into 3 words.
Yeah, so we were joking around about this last week, and I think that how I broke it down was people, programs, and publication. That assessment is okay. What has the student learned? What has the student gained? What have the people involved in it developed in, and how have they changed through this? Evaluation is looking at the program and how is the program being run? How is the program achieving its outcomes? And then publication is sort of, is this designed for inside, or is quality assurance, quality checking, or is this for outside? Is this geared around testing a theory, like Sarah said, or is this geared around finding out if things are being missed and publishing that information? And that's the research area. So yeah, people, programs, and publication. Jeff, did you want to add anything in on that? All right, so we're going to stay with Sarah. Oh, did I skip a slide there? No, I didn't. Okay, so Sarah, how do you train others in assessment, and how many people do you train?
That is an excellent question. Truthfully, it really ranges from teams of 3 to teams of 40, depending on the size of the units that we're working with. When Jeff and I did our training for the Western Professional Development Certificate, I think we had 110 people that were present on that webinar. And so those are some folks that were both internal and external. So it really depends on if I'm just working with a unit or a department, or I'm working with a larger group. Right now we're training everyone virtually. And so that has been a bit of an interesting learning experience as well, because at least from my experience in the field, almost all of the trainings I've ever done have been in person. And I think that building that relationship with someone, especially in a unit that maybe you don't work with as frequently or you don't bump into for coffee, is a lot more organic when you can sit down and have a conversation and build a rapport with them than it necessarily is virtually. So I've started to learn that there are times and groups you really need to understand your colleagues and their needs, and who they are, where it's more effective to have a one-on-one or a small group consultation. There's some folks who do best when you send them resources ahead of time and give them time and space to reflect, to write down questions and come prepared to talk to you about what they want to know more about or where they're struggling. And then there's time and space to do more informal trainings that people can elect to be a part of because they recognize that they want some additional competency-based skill. And so we really try and do a combination of all of these in helping folks understand the value of a conversation versus the value of attending a large group workshop. And we offer them in very different ways. But I would say since the pandemic, we've really moved specifically to consultations, team consultations or individual consultations, where you can really understand, especially as people are pivoting their programs and they're experiencing challenges and trying to rethink, not only how do we assess this differently, but how do we actually implement or offer this differently in a virtual setting? We found that the conversation and guiding through, and again, using those inquiry-based questions helps us understand them and then give us an idea of the tools and resources that we can provide to them and the way that our team can best support them in really thinking about their assessment practice.
Thank you, Sarah. And let's pitch it over to Jeff now.
I guess in theory, I mean, how many people should I be training? 500-ish. I actually don't know how many people are in our entire division. That's not a realistic number, but I mean, like in theory, that's kind of like the scope of our division. And when I think back when we used to do a lot of, let's say, topic-based training, I'm saying we here a little bit, typically myself and someone else on one of the teams, the careers team, the student life team, the accessibility team, leading different workshops and training on different assessment related topics. It was always interesting and challenging when you have you have 25 folks and you have 2 folks from each department or division. It can be really rich conversation, learning selfishly for me, but also really challenging because their own situations are so unique. It's really hard to sort of customize. So I think, and I'm going to try and multitask here. So I'm actually going to share a list of the workshops that we used to run. If we ever get back to something resembling normal situations again, face-to-face stuff, we may sort of try to do this, but I really do a lot more at the departmental level. What's good about that is ideally get to have lots of conversations with the director about what their priorities are. Do they really want to focus just on let's start with learning outcomes and let's make sure everybody's working together on learning outcomes before we get too far into this idea of approaches and data collection techniques and things like that. So I think about this idea of strategy, utilization, capacity, right? Strategy, I think a lot about, trying to forms, templates, documents, longer visions other than I've got an event this afternoon I need a survey for, which I get those requests too. Utilization, I think what Sarah shared is I think Western has a really good model for sharing back. I think given sort of my dual role in spending a lot of time in surveys, I have a role in sort of sharing back large scale survey data. And I'll share an example of that I don't know if I'll get in trouble for, but this is, we find that a lot of people, a lot of the surveys, the surveys are huge. Whoops, that's not the document, I just shared it twice. A lot of the surveys are really, really big and most questions don't apply directly to their work. So what I have tried to do is go through the 6 different large scale surveys that U of T operates in and grab some related parts specifically for student life folks to try and present a comprehensive and messy picture of kind of all things related to sort of student experiences in the sort of co-curricular area. And I've dropped a copy. That presentation is 4 years old. So please, anyone who's looking at that, please be mindful of that. But it is an example of trying to sort of pull together different pieces. That's capacity is sort of the last piece, and that's really the training thing. And while I may not do this at the full divisional level, I think it's happening much more in the department level. And it would kind of perhaps offer to a director, I'm we can talk about anything you want, but maybe it's easier for you to sort of like look at this list of 10 different things like in that Word document and like, do some of these sort of strike you as more of where you feel like your team is at or what you see as the needs for your team over the next few months? So I think that's probably how I'd answer that question.
Thank you. And we're going to move to something Jeff's actually talked about already in the chat, but we're going to talk about it here now. And that is research ethics boards. So does your institution do research ethics board approval, required evaluations at all in student affairs? When, why? And outside of REBs, are there formal ethics requirements that you have in place for assessment and evaluation in student affairs? We're going to start with Jeff. Jeff, who is still muted.
I swear I hit the button. Non-appointed faculty members at University of Toronto can't directly apply for research ethics. Even if, as I mentioned, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people in my division that are doctoral or terminal degree holders, we cannot apply for research ethics unless we have a faculty appointment. That's quite few folks, probably most in the health and wellness area, much less in other parts of the institution. I would say once a year I apply for an REB application. It's almost always to do with a survey that is about campus climate, health and wellness, sexual violence, in some of those sort of range of topics. I basically write an REB application. I send it to my vice provost students who submits it on my behalf, which is an incredibly inefficient and poor use of their time, but that's the process we have. So as a result, we really, as Sarah mentioned before, and I think Western has a really good process. I don't review all of the projects. I don't think I have the capacity I would assume that most of what folks are doing are really in that quality improvement, program improvement, sort of whatever language they might use. I think there's a real gray area and we probably should talk more about. And like, if I collect data and I want to use it, like for the publication part, I think most people understand that. If I want to use it in a conference presentation, I'm really curious where that sort of like kind of fits in depending on what data and how you collect it, who you collect it from. I feel like student affairs folks are on a little bit sort of dicey territory and we should probably have more conversations about that. I have no answers, but I think it's an important conversation. Like, what can I share at CACUSS is a really good question. So those are my thoughts on that.
Very much so, yeah. And that is a great conversation for us to have in the future, definitely. Sarah.
I really like Jeff's point around, how do we decide what we can share and when we can share, and how different that looks at every institution. At all 4 institutions I've worked at, that process has been very different. And so I'd be curious to know, even from folks on here, how does that look on your campus? And I think that there's an opportunity as a field to really talk about that more, and what does that mean in terms of the impact of our work and how we can share with each other opportunities to grow and develop competencies, but also, best practices in working with RABs if we have to. In Western's case, we do have to go through research ethics, but really only if we're doing that R piece that we've defined as that testing piece, or really large scale surveys. So if you think about the Thriving Quotient, which we're about to launch, we have to go through them and make sure that we get their approval, or we're exempt from it, but they're aware of it. And there's a principal investigator on those large scale projects that actually does that on our behalf, which right now is our Director of Research Assessment and Planning. But one of the tools that we use, and I'm going to post it here in the chat, that has really changed the way that we think about research versus quality assurance and quality improvement, is the screening tool from Alberta. And it basically is a questionnaire, and you complete it, or we encourage every program that we work with in their assessment plan to complete it, and to really think deeply about the program that you're offering and what you want to know about it. And when you go through this screening tool, it basically pops out green, yellow, or red. Green being everything that you've indicated in this questionnaire says that for all purposes, it's quality assurance, quality improvement. Yellow pops out and says, most of the things that you noted were QA, QI, but there might be a couple pieces, and here's what they were that you need to think about a bit more in detail. And red being, this is definitely a research project and not quality assurance, quality improvement. And we use that as a screening tool. So basically, well, as our programs are thinking about whether it be a survey or a formative assessment tool, if they get the green light, they send it to us so we have it on record, and they can move forward under QA, QI, recognizing that we won't be publishing that, but we can think about using it as a case study. If it's yellow, it comes back to us. We have a conversation at our team level and try to understand why it might have been yellow and what tweaks we might need to make. And then the director of research assessment and planning approves it or supports with how do we tweak these things appropriately, or it comes back as red, in which they have to send it to us. And then we think about, this is a full-blown research study and we need to talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how we can support you with that. But in the meantime, how do we do some formal assessments while figuring out what this research project could look like? And so that tool has made an immense amount of difference for us in how often we need to connect with research, because they trust the tool and have approved the tool. And it also is really helpful in building capacity, because it encourages the folks in other departments who don't do assessment, but have it as a part of, you know, their job, in thinking about, oh, okay, what do I want to know? And does this pass? And am I allowed to use this? So it's really helped give them some independence in how they think about implementing assessment and the ethical pieces of that as well.
Thank you, Sarah. That's awesome. And just so people know, we are also going to, when we post this on YouTube, we'll have all of these links posted there as well, so that people can access these resources. All right, next up, Sarah. This is the penultimate question. So what is the most interesting innovation you've seen recently in assessment? And I find this a really important question, especially since we have all wildly changed how we do some things in the last couple months.
Oh my goodness, this is like a high pressure question. I have a few different answers. I think, so for those of you who don't know me, I love formative assessment. I love the ones called classroom assessment techniques in particular, because they spell cats and I'm a crazy cat lady, self-admitted. Mine hasn't shown up yet. Usually she joins these calls. But what I really appreciate about the pandemic is it has started to encourage folks to think about, how do we do assessment that we would have maybe done in person using cue cards or carousel style worksheets, or discussions in more of an online way. So the innovations for me have been around, you know, how people have been posting around the Zoom tools that you can use to like scrape the chat and do NLP or natural language processing on it. How you can utilize the whiteboard feature to get people to anonymously type things. How we can think about, you know, Jeff mentioned Pull Everywhere and Kahoot and Padlet, and all these tools that existed before, but maybe weren't being leveraged in the same way, that not only collect assessment data, but also provide really engaging learning experiences for our students outside of, I'm going to speak to you about what's on the slide, or I'm going to put you in a breakout room to have a conversation. And I think it's really innovative when you can say to a student, pull out your cell phone and type this in. Like, they're not quote unquote allowed to do that, you know, in person a lot of the time. And so how do we make it exciting for them and recognize that technology is something that they're so in tune with, and now we as educators have to become a bit more in tune with that. So how do we leverage that technology? So I would say just the push of innovation towards not just recognizing it's there, but actually using the tools and understanding the abilities they have to give us data. And then my second piece would be, for me, it's really innovative to think about equity-minded assessment. And I know this work has been, you know, happening for a couple of years, but especially as we pivot and we think about, like, what does equity and access look like in a virtual space and how we adapt our programs. I think there's a lot of really great work happening in conversations on campuses around how do we think about equity-minded innovative assessment, and what does that mean for our students?
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Jeff.
I think I've got 2.5 answers to that. One is that I totally agree with everything Sarah says. I think, so we use an Orbis platform for an awful lot of our registration processes. For almost, we did before, and we use it for probably 95% of sort of a lot of events, activities, workshops, those types of things. And I think Sarah's seen some of this, and it's pretty well integrated. So we have better data than we've ever had before. And we would have only had that because folks have been sort of, I hate to use the word funnel, it's the only word in my mind, have been funneled sort of through all registration processes are taking place through this platform. So we have much better data now on who's registering and who's attending a whole range of programs and services than we ever did before. And this gives us the start to be able to sort of look at this through an equity lens. And I find that incredibly a lot of possibilities, I would say. We would know that most of our programs are never sort of intended to be for all 90,000 students at the University of Toronto, but to get a sense of like, if we think this is our target market or our target thing, are we, we think we're getting students with really high or we're targeting this maybe at students that are struggling GPA wise, but does it turn out we're actually getting students that mostly have 4.0 GPAs? Like we have an ability to integrate that now that we didn't do before. The second piece, sort of building on what Sarah talked about at equity, is that I guess back in September, I'm going to switch screens real quick here, is that the Scarborough campus hosted 9 series of dialogues, really called the National Dialogues. And this was a series of conversations about inclusive higher education with a real focus on anti-Black racism at colleges and universities across Canada. 9 different sets of conversations. I think they're all worth it. There's maybe 100 hours of content, so you probably get through them all. There is one specifically on the topic of race-based data collection, which I think is a topic that is slowly coming sort of up more and more. And if I were to sort of bring this back to U of T, I think the most interesting thing we've done is really not related to my office, is that in November, we launched our student equity census. And I can share a little bit of information about that here. Let me do a quick refresh. So we now have a tool that over several years, and I do stress that part, several years, will start giving us much better information about who students are and how they identify in the myriad of ways they identify, with the goal that, asking this far less in a lot of programs and services and surveys, and really using this to inform a lot of conversations. I can't give you access to the questions, but if you know of anyone who's even a part-time student at U of T, they can get you access to all the questions. So that's what I would say. That's something I find innovative. We haven't gotten to the utilization part, but that's coming. So I'm excited by that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And sort of building on what the two of you have just said, what is a key resource, article, or podcast for people? And also drop a link for it into the chat. And we're going to start with Jeff. Jeff, who is still muted.
For me, the single most sort of useful resource I have and I have access to, I would say, is the Student Affairs Assessment Listserv. I have it set up. It's a folder in my inbox. I don't look at every message that comes in because the people are wonderful and they share so much. Most of it's American. I don't say that's a bad thing, just as a statement of fact. But in terms of templates and resources, so much free PD, a lot of the workshops that maybe Sarah was alluding to about equity-minded assessment, a lot of that stuff is being published through that. It's where I've met some of the folks actually on this call. Bill Heinrich was a person I think I first met through those conversations. So I think it's a wonderful free resource. And I've just found the folks on there just incredibly willing to share. Just incredibly willing to share. And that's awesome because not a lot of folks have a divisional-wide responsibility. Most folks are. So it means that I can, grab resources or at least look at other people's resources and then consider like, how might we use this or adapt this for our local context. So Student Affairs Assessment Listserv, A+.
Thanks, Jeff. And Sarah, what is your key resource?
I echo that. I love the listserv. I find it so helpful and resourceful. And one area that I don't think we talk about enough is people actually post jobs and job descriptions. And the number of folks, like directors, who have reached out to Jeff and I saying like, I really want to start thinking about what a student affairs assessment position could look like. Could we have your job description, or what do you include in it? I actually find the listserv really helpful in providing additional job descriptions than my own to folks who are looking at expanding these opportunities. My resource that I'm putting in there is related to the equity-minded assessment. It's the spectrum, if you will, from Dr. Gavin Henning and Dr. Ann Lundquist. And this is particularly from NILOA, and they updated this paper in January 2020, so it's relatively recent. And I put that in there because we are really trying on my campus to think about equity-minded assessment and how do we do that. I think like anything, in theory, it's really great, but to do it well, you really have to invest the time in thinking about what does that look like and how do we do it. And so to give you a couple examples, we're talking about data sovereignty on my campus. When people reach out and say, I want all of this data, is it our responsibility to give that to you? Do we have permission to give that to you? If we've collected data, for example, on Indigenous student experiences, we need to make sure we go back to our Indigenous Support Center and make sure that they're comfortable with us sharing that, because that is their data that informs, their decision making. And so thinking about that. And then the other thing is Western starting to think at an institutional level about what demographic questions do we put in our survey panels and what does that look like? Right now we use Census Canada because it's the most legal way to integrate that and ask those questions, but it doesn't get at the intersectionality of our students. Nor does it necessarily include all of the groups on campus that self-identify. So I think, thinking about this spectrum has really helped us consider ways that we can reshape the work that we do and integrate appropriate and meaningful equity practices into so many parts of our assessment. But what are those, one or two things each year we can do that are meaningful that will help us slowly move along the spectrum?
Thank you, Sarah. All right, this is going to be where we open this up to everybody. And we're going to ask just a little bit of I think just sort of one overarching question that's got a bunch of parts to it. And let's see, does everybody know how to use the raise a hand feature? Is that going to be the best way, I think? What I'd like you to do is consider this next question. What does assessment and evaluation look like at your institution? So if you want to talk about the process and structure, if you want to talk about the assessment cycle, if you want to talk about communicating the findings of assessment or about leadership or training or ethics, this is what we're interested in. So just use the raise a hand feature so that I'll be able to call on people as we go through here. And who would like to start us off? Don't everybody click that button at once. Or if you want to sort of ask your own question, or if you'd like to post it in the chat, I'll read it out for everybody to hear, and that way we can sort of have that discussion that way if you prefer text. Bill, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Bill Heinrich. I'm currently at Orbis Communications, which is a platform that many of you might be using. But I'm working on my role at Orbis is not in software, but in actually researching and understanding the future role of the kind of assessment work in higher ed. I'm a scholar of higher ed and experiential learning by training. For those of you who don't know me, Jeff, good to see you. Hi, Sarah. So my question for the conversation is really we're seeing an increase in the role of recognition of student learning, and I'm curious about how that's showing up in in the sort of assessment offices proper. Like, how is that your role? Is that your role? I can imagine the range of responses we might hear, but how does that show up? Is my first and starting question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Sarah, Jeff, would one of you like to handle that one?
Go ahead, Jeff Burrow.
Recognition, Bill, is that the main question? I mean, we're using platforms. I think I'm not sure if this is what you're talking about. I think we're probably not waiting. We're really curious what the provincial government sort of might come out with to see how much maybe we keep going in our own directions. Maybe we take some lead from whatever they're nudging us to. How much money is in it if they are nudging or encouraging you to sort of the measure thing. So much of what we report back to them is really seats type of stuff, right? Like just basic numbers. So little of it is learning. I think we are much closer to sort of getting discussions on retention and graduation at a broader level than learning, which, hopefully one is part of the other, but I don't have a great answer about this. I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have just let you go first.
Well, I think I truthfully could think about it in different ways. One of the things that we're noticing on our campus is I would say that we've had a lot of faculty recognize the value of co-curricular learning since we've pivoted, because they've reached out for support on, student mental health. They've reached out a lot on ensuring students are engaged and community building, and really thinking about the pieces that they don't necessarily contribute to directly every day. And that awareness has been really great because it's allowed us to formulate some relationships. And so now we're trying to think about how do we take that data to continue to build those relationships with faculty in saying, we recognize that student learning happens outside of the classroom. Here's how we do that, whether it be the co-curricular record, we use Orbis as well, learning experience catalog, and what is the value to students holistically in that. And so for recognition piece, I think it's about recognizing student learning outside the classroom as a piece of that. We're also really invested in career ready skills. So how do we measure what career readiness looks like? And so, thinking about the knowledge, skills, and values that students are gaining in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and what sets them apart. What kind of career ready skills are they gaining, for example, at Western, that they can utilize to be recognized by, potential colleagues or future employers that make them look more attractive or different than other students. So I would say from recognition, it's career readiness, it's recognition of the value of co-curricular pieces, and then just students recognizing the skills that they gain from things they don't even recognize they're doing, like being a part of a club, for example. So how do we measure and translate that? I think that would be my answer.
Thank you both. Yeah, that's it is a pretty big topic that is definitely being brought up, especially with the rise of micro-credentials as well, and where that's going to fit in with co-curricular work. And a lot of that is going to come back to the assessment people, because a lot of it's going to come back to creation of outcomes and having very specific, in order to move from a model where you recognize the time someone spends to the learning they gained, you really need to focus in on the outcomes. And so I think that's probably going to be passed over to the assessment and evaluation people in the next few years. Anybody else who'd like to talk a little bit about what their institution does? Okay. All right, then I'm going to move into the last bit here, and that is, does anybody else have any links or resources or questions they'd like to pose, or anything like that? Anything they'd want to bring up at this point, or if there's resources you want to share with people? I was going to drop the information about Essay Relay, but Jeff already did that one.
I'm a total stand for that. So I'm really curious. Sarah and I had a conversation. I'll pose this to the group. I've been thinking a lot about the trade-off between doing formative assessment right at the end of an event, program, whatever, and later. And I do think about trade-offs in that the longer folks wait, if you wait a week or two after an event or a situation, you obviously have time. You can ask different questions and do different assessment because you can talk about application and implementation. If you ask at the end of the workshop, you're really asking, like, something different, how confident someone may feel, their thoughts, their potential next steps. But we've seen such a dramatic drop in those those 1 week later types of response rates for surveys. I really struggle to think about in which situations is it worth it. So I don't know. There's not really a well-formed question there, but I'm curious to hear some folks' thoughts about this idea of like post event assessment, summative assessment versus like at the end of an event or workshop. There was a question in there somewhere, I think.
And if anybody wants to unmute and answer that question, feel free.
was hoping someone had the answer for me.
I think it's primarily contextual. And I say that
Yeah,
from the lens
makes
of
sense.
not just campus specific, but even some programs we see, students are willing to do both at a very high rate. And in other programs, they're willing to do the in the moment piece because it's there and it's built into the learning experience, but then they won't complete the post. Or the opposite, where they're really quiet like this in a space like this, and then everybody's willing to do the post reflection. And so that's something, I think it's a good question, Jeff, and I'd be curious to know how other people are tackling that as well, because at least in my case, it's based on the program or the learning experience, which we are learning as we go, which ones benefit from a both approach or an either approach.
Okay. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us here today, and especially I wanted to thank Sarah and Jeff for being our panelists this week. So this is the first of several roundtables that have been planned out, and they're going to be continuing pretty much once a month. And for the next couple months, oh, we've got a question from Brock. Jeff and Sarah, do you have much of a relationship or interactions with your institutional research offices? What could that look like? Jeff, do you want to start that?
Yeah, the single best thing my supervisor did when hiring me was include someone from that office on my hiring committee. And I think that set up was the starting thing of building some trust and some relationships that, hey, these people, student life, and the people they're hiring, they're not the bouncy castle people maybe I thought they were, or that was my previous interaction. So I go to them. They're the folks that hold the samples. I'm not sure, Brock, if that's the question, but they're the folks who have access when we need to do something large. They're the folks who have that. They're also the people a level sort of above that. I think I heard, I can't remember, there was a conversation with data governance, and those are the people I need to work with a lot to really think about access at different levels and stuff like that. So I think it's really challenging. It's the most important relationship I probably have on campus because they have access to the big things. And it's been so enlightening for me to understand how complex those systems are. When I say, hey, I need this data and this data, they're like, we have 25 different fields that relate to international student status, so it really helps me see so much more complexity in the institution. I probably talk with these folks at least once a week. How you start that conversation when you don't have that, I guess, I mean, if there's been anything you've been working on in the past or a previous project, I'm trying to think about like, what are those pieces that you could use to perhaps start that conversation? And it's really about like, what is there something that's maybe a shared piece? So do they help to coordinate on large scales? Do they run CACUSS or NESI or any of those types of things for you? Because I think that student affairs folks, including myself, we put a very different lens on that survey that the curricular folks would. So I wonder if that's an in. I think the NESI survey has so much utility for student affairs folks that goes completely underutilized. And I'd love to do that webinar sometime too, actually.
Thank you. Sarah.
I would echo Jeff's sentiment. I'm actually very fortunate. My director came from research or institutional research, so she already had those relationships established, and we're able to really leverage those because of the great work she has done and the colleagues there. At my previous institution, we were completely disconnected from institutional research, and I actually utilized NESI as an opportunity to build that relationship by saying, hey, I worked in residence, did assessment specifically for residents at the time. Hey, we'd really love to know the resident student population of NESI. And instead of just saying, can you give me the data? I said, would you mind sitting with me and walking me through it? And would you like to do a presentation to our department on how this data informs our work and what we can utilize from it to help inform our work? And I think even just the invitation to be a presenter and to share the work that they're very proud of and that they work so hard on really cemented that relationship from the beginning and helped me leverage it and collaborate with them and be a part of panels and task forces and committees by their invitation that I might not have been otherwise, just because I simply demonstrated an effort and appreciation for their work. So if you're struggling there or you're thinking about how to do that, I think bringing them in and then utilizing that as an opportunity to build a collaborative relationship is a good start.
Thank you. And yeah, just wanted to finish off by saying thank you for everybody for joining us today. Next month, we will be having one on what assessment looks like across Canada, because it does have some regional variations. And so for that one, we're going to be having Leslie D'Souza, and we are going to be having Cindy James as our panelists. So hopefully everybody is looking forward to that. And thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.